stop everything. What if everything you think you know about death is only a piece of the story? Imagine there is an old manual tucked away in the frost-wind corridors of the Himalayas, whose pages claim to map the moments after we draw our last breath. It does not promise neat answers. It promises a roadmap, a set of directions through states of mind that might determine whether consciousness dissolves into something unrecognizable, clings to habit, or slips once and for all into liberation. This is the mystery at the heart of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, known in Tibetan as the Bardo Thodol. For centuries, it has been read at the bedside of the dying, chanted by lamas, studied by monastics, and examined by curious outsiders, psychologists, philosophers, and survivors of near-death experiences. Today, we are going to unravel its essential claims, place them in dialogue with modern accounts of the dying mind, and consider what it would mean to live as if death were the most important practice of all. If this topic stirs something in you, a question, a memory, a story, leave a comment below. I want to hear what you think people actually encounter at the borders of life. The Bardo Thodol is not a book in the way modern readers expect. It is a ritual text embedded in a living tradition. Traditionally, Tibetan communities treated it as a practical manual to be recited aloud for someone who has just died. Bardo translates roughly as in-between state, and Thodol can be rendered as liberation by hearing. The text as received in the Tibetan tradition is thought to be a set of spoken instructions. Through the voice of a realized teacher, the dying person is instructed on how to recognize what they are seeing, and in that recognition, possibly be liberated. Historically, the story of how the Bardo Thodol arrived in human hands is wrapped in the same kind of secrecy and sacredness that surrounds many Tibetan texts. It is often described as a revealed teaching, a terma, hidden by a master and rediscovered by a later revealer. That framework places the text inside a ritual culture that assumes certain possibilities for the mind at death, that awareness continues to have content, that content is shaped by past deeds and mental patterns, and that, crucially, recognition can change the outcome. These are not propositions that modern science confirms or denies. They are working hypotheses within a spiritual system crafted to address dying directly. To read the Bardo Thodol is to enter a map of transitions. The tradition organizes the journey into a sequence of bardos, distinct named states through which consciousness is set to pass. For our purposes, three principal phases dominate. The moment of death, where a phenomenon called the clear light is said to briefly reveal reality's naked luminosity. The intermediate visions, a psychedelic theater of peaceful and wrathful figures that are said to be projections of the mind. And the bardo of becoming, where karmic forces congeal into the structure of a next life. Each of these stages is not merely poetic. In the Tibetan framework, they are practical. They are moments when specific responses, or failures to respond, determine the soul's trajectory. But before we step into those inner theaters, it helps to notice something the Tibetan model makes explicit. Bardos are not only about dying. They are any liminal state where identity loosens and the usual orientation of self falters. Falling asleep, being in labor, a deep meditation retreat, a sudden trauma, each can function as a small bardo, a rehearsal, or a mirror. That idea reframes death from being an abrupt endpoint into a culmination of patterns lived now. If you practice recognizing subtle shifts in daily life, the breath that breaks a chain of anxious thoughts, the pause before a reaction, then the logic of the Bardo Thodol suggests you are rehearsing for the final tests the mind will meet when it is stripped of bodily anchors. Now imagine the moment of death as the tradition describes it. The collapse of gross bodily systems gives way to subtler currents. Sensation thins, a brightness appears, not necessarily a photographically literal light, but an uncompromising, luminous presence that feels like the most honest face you have ever seen. Tibetan teachers call this the clear light. It is described as the mind's fundamental clarity, the raw, luminous nature of awareness before it becomes entangled with thought and fear. If the dying person recognizes this state as what it is, not as an attractive vision to cling to, not as something to panic about, but as the bare, luminous nature of mind, then liberation is said to be possible. This is not a guarantee or an easy promise. The account emphasizes how easy it is to miss this instant, how quickly habit can drag awareness into fear, and how that fear becomes a kind of centrifugal force pulling consciousness toward continued existence. To make sense of this, picture again the clear light as the mirror before any image appears. When the mirror is clean, it reflects without distortion. But if you are used to seeing only reflections, to confusing the reflection for your own face, you might either fixate on it or recoil. The Bardo Thodol's crucial instruction is to recognize the mirror for what it is. Recognition, within the tradition, is the key to liberation. That claim contains both hope and urgency. It asks of the dying a clarity of mind that most of us never cultivate in ordinary life. At this point, I need to be clear. When I describe the clear light, I am relaying a map offered by a religious tradition.
Contemporary researchers in near-death phenomena have documented experiences that sound remarkably similar to many of these descriptions. Reports of intense, unfiltered light, sensations of cosmic unity, and encounters with beings of light. Jung, psychoanalysts, and contemporary psychologists have used archetypal and symbolic language to make sense of these experiences. But none of this proves the metaphysical claims. It points to convergences, patterns worth studying and contemplating, not to settled fact. Consider this an invitation to explore, rather than a verdict. The Bardo Thodol moves quickly from the clear light into the next arena, the Bardo of visions. Whereas the clear light is described as an immediate, luminous possibility, the visions Bardo is theatrical. In some passages, the text catalogues luminous, serene forms that appear like deities, companions that radiate compassion and gentleness, and then terrifying, wrathful forms that lash and roar. The language is vivid, often deliberately so. The peaceful deities are said to appear in mesmerizing radiance, the wrathful ones in forms meant to jolt. But here lies one of the tradition's most psychologically astute moves. These figures are not external authorities imposing themselves on the dying. They are described as projections of the individual's own mind. They are, in the tradition's words, appearances of one's own mental continuum. Seen in that light, the theater of visions is an inner diagnostic. The shapes, tones, and narratives that surge in the dying mind are expressive of habits, fears, unintegrated potentials, and unresolved clinging. To the Tibetan eye, an appearance of terror or of charm offers the same question to the mind. Do you recognize this as yourself? Do you see that the figure is shaped by you? If recognition occurs, the figure dissolves into the clarity from which it arose. If not, the figure's pull becomes the hook for further becoming. When Western thinkers encountered these descriptions, many saw parallels with Jung's idea of archetypes, primordial images arising from the collective unconscious that surface in dreams, myths, and active imaginations. A wrathful deity could be read as an eruption of a shadow archetype, a condensed projection of fears and aggressive force. A peaceful deity could be a representation of an integrated, benevolent tendency. Jung did not write about Tibetan bardos specifically, but his framework helps translate the Bardo Thodol for certain modern readers. The visions are intelligible as symbolic events that demand recognition. Another set of parallels comes from contemporary accounts of near-death experiences. People who return from clinical death often describe a sequence, an overwhelming bright presence, encounters with luminous beings, and then, in some cases, a feeling of being propelled back into the body by a pull or a sense of unfinished obligation.
These reports are not uniform, and the research field is careful to note differences in culture, expectation, and interpretation. Still, the pattern of an initial clarity, followed by a theater of images, and then a directional pressure toward rebirth, resonates strikingly with the Tibetan model. Once more, these correspondences are suggestive, not conclusive. They ask us to consider the possibility that certain processes of the dying mind may have universal contours, even as cultural lenses shape their content. One of the most humane and immediately tangible practices attached to the Bardo Thodol is the role of the guide at the bedside. Across Tibet, as in many cultures, death is not solitary. Families, friends, and trained practitioners gather. A lama's reading of the text is not ritual theater. It is, within its cultural context, a practical support. The lama speaks, instructs, and sings to the dying person, naming the lights and forms that will appear, encouraging recognition. The reading functions on many levels. It can be calming, It can provide verbal cues that align with the dying person's mental processes. It can, according to the tradition, directly influence how the mind orients. Imagine a late-night scene in a small Himalayan room. A narrow window frames cold stars, a butter lamp throws molten gold across prayer flags, and the air smells of incense and yak butter. In the center of that room, family members form a loose circle, hands folded. A lama sits near the bed, an old book resting on his knees, voice steady. He speaks slowly, the cadence tempered by compassion. He names what the dying might see. Do not be taken by fear when the light appears. Do not chase subtle pleasures. He calls out images, luminous faces, saber-toothed animals, towering palaces, and he frames them as mirrors of the mind. He chants mantras to support clarity, but he does not command the mind like a military general. Rather, he is a companion, a witness, and a voice intended to help the one who is leaving keep their bearings. This bedside scene is instructive for several reasons. First, it highlights that the Bardo Thodol was never a purely abstract cosmology. It was a practical technology of care, designed to address the immediate needs of the dying and their communities. Second, it reframes dying as an interpersonal event. Presence, speech, intimacy, and touch matter. Third, and important for our modern ears, it suggests a model of accompaniment rooted less in metaphysical assertion and more in compassionate support. A lama's confidence about the nature of the after-death states is not merely a metaphysical claim, it is an expertise born of ritual, practice, and community. We can also look at what Western clinicians and palliative caregivers have observed. In modern hospital wards, what calms a dying person is often uncomplicated human presence, a steady voice, a hand on the shoulder, someone to name what is happening.
In that sense, the lama's bedside practice finds an echo in contemporary hospice care. Ritual shapes the contours of assistance, but the underlying human need, not to die alone, to have one's experience recognized, is universal. Moving from the bedside into the theater of visions requires attention to how the tradition describes those visions. The wealth of images in the Bardo Thodol is astonishing. Blinding lights, palaces and landscapes that shift like the mind's own weather, beings whose faces can be both compassionate and terrifying. The text, mindful of human fallibility, instructs listeners to refuse attachment and aversion alike. A bright, inviting form is as risky as a terrifying one. Both can deceive. The practice, therefore, is recognition. See them for what they are, formations of mind, and do not grasp. A modern reader might ask, are these descriptions literal phenomenology or metaphors? The tradition would likely answer both. The figures are phenomenological, they are what the dying person experiences, and they are also pedagogical metaphors, tools to teach practitioners how to relate to mind. From another angle, psychologists would point out that when the brain is exiting its typical metabolic states, neural cascades may generate intense visual and emotional phenomena. Cultural memory, personal symbolism, and lifelong habits of attention then fill those raw currents with recognizable forms. The Bardo Thodol, in this sense, functions as a template. It supplies a language for interpreting and orienting amid the mind's last storms. Here it is important to insert a short, sober disclaimer. Scholars, neuroscientists, and clinicians study near-death phenomena and consciousness with growing interest, but there is no scientific consensus that the specific metaphysical claims of any religious system, Tibetan Buddhism included, are empirically proven. The parallels between accounts merit curiosity and respectful study, but they do not, by themselves, settle ontological questions. What they do offer is an invitation to cross-investigate. How do cultural frameworks shape the dying mind, and how might specific practices modulate the person's experience at the edge? The Bardo Thodol's treatment of the visions also contains a radical psychological proposition. The forms one encounters are not neutral. They arise from one's own mental continuum, and crucially, are malleable. If disordered habits of mind, greed, anger, ignorance dominate a life, the visions that appear will likely be dominated by the corresponding tones. Conversely, if compassionate recognition has been cultivated, the visions may be experienced as compassionate. This is not a blame-the-victim doctrine. Tibetan practice emphasizes that conditioning accumulates across countless lifetimes and circumstances. It is a description, not a moral indictment. But it is also an ethical proposition. How we shape our minds now matters.
This ethical weight leads the tradition to propose preparatory practices,
daily meditation on impermanence, the practice of Tonglen, a meditative exchange in which one visualizes taking on others' suffering and giving compassion in return, the recitation of mantras, and the cultivation of moral discipline are presented as ways to train the heart and mind to recognize the clear light and to remain steady in the face of terrifying appearances. These practices, in the tradition, are not so much mystical shortcuts as forms of rewiring. They gradually alter the patterns that will most likely continue into transitional states. Before we proceed further into the second Bardo and toward the question of rebirth, it's worth pausing on Tonglen and the ethics of preparation. Tonglen, literally sending and taking, is a practice that invites the practitioner to breathe in the pain of others and breathe out relief or compassion. For many modern practitioners, it is profoundly countercultural. Rather than reinforcing boundaries that protect the self, it intentionally breaks them, using breath and imagination to cultivate a radical intercorporeal empathy. In the context of death preparation, Tonglen could be understood as a rehearsal for dissolving the boundary between self and other, an orientation that might radically reshape the imagery and affect that arise in the Bardos. Yet a careful reader must note the explicit limits here. It would be irresponsible to present Tonglen or mantra recitation as a surefire method to guarantee liberation. The Bardo Thodol itself, as transmitted and interpreted by many teachers, acknowledges the variability of outcomes. Practices increase the probability of recognition. They do not produce mechanical results. The tradition is close to the view that intentional cultivation alters the terrain, but the terrain is complex and partially opaque. As we move closer to the Bardo of rebirth, we can already hear the outline of the Tibetan argument. Recognition at the moment of death alters orientation. The visions provide opportunities for recognition or entrapment. And if recognition fails, the momentum of habit, craving, and unexamined identity condenses into the formative processes that create a new life. This third phase, the Bardo of becoming, is often described with images of painters and sculptors. Your mind paints a scene. You are drawn into its logic. A life is formed around that composition. At the threshold between the visions and becoming, the narrative tightens. Suppose a person fails to recognize the clear light and then is terrified by the wrathful forms, or seduced by peaceful forms that feel warm and attractive. The text warns that attachment or fear will generate momentum. That momentum becomes centripetal, pulling the consciousness into further embodiment.
In the Tibetan cosmology, this is a karmically patterned process. Mental tendencies, ethical residues, and the weight of past inclinations provide the vector for the next life's contours. The notion is not meant to be a cosmic judgment, so much as a description of a self-perpetuating mechanism. The mind tends to repeat familiar motions unless something interrupts its pattern. While we will soon examine the Bardo of rebirth in greater detail, including how the tradition imagines the mechanics of karma and the role of intention, there is a crucial middle ground that deserves emphasis. The Bardo Thodol does not regard death as a single theatrical event that eliminates personal agency. Even within the Bardo states, there are choices, micro-moments of recognition, attentional acts, small reorientations that can change direction. That is the practical heart of the teaching. Training in life is training for death, because the mind's last moves are composed from its prior habits. As the narrative builds here, let us bring in one more contemporary lens. Reports from near-death experiencers and some lines of neuroscientific inquiry suggest that certain brain states at death are characterized by intense activation and disorganization, which could produce vivid experiential content. Psychologists and philosophers debate whether these are merely neurobiological artifacts or windows into something deeper. The important methodological stance is humility. Phenomenology matters, and subjective reports are data, but interpretation must remain provisional. The Bardo Thodol, as a cultural artifact, offers a coherent interpretive frame for those subjective reports. That makes it valuable, not necessarily because it is metaphysically true in an absolute sense, but because it provides people with a language to orient themselves, a language with practical rituals and ethical prescriptions. Our journey so far has traversed the early terrain of the Bardo Thodol, its cultural pedigree, the basic map of Bardos, the luminous possibility of the clear light, the theatrical visions, and the ethical weight of preparation. We have listened at the bedside to a lama's steady voice, and we have noted how modern narratives of near-death experience echo parts of this ancient map. But the story grows more complex when we ask the hard questions. How much of the Bardo's account is culturally elaborated symbolism? What parts could plausibly reflect universal phenomenology of dying? And crucially,
what does it mean to live in the light of these teachings? The Bardo Thodol invites a radical reorientation towards impermanence. It does not present death as the enemy to be postponed or sanitized. Instead, it frames every ending as a rehearsal, and every ordinary lapse of attention as the beginning of a habituated pattern that, left unexamined, will unfold at the most consequential moment. That is a demanding ethic.
It asks for continuous practice, for a fearless inspection of one's own mind, and for a humility about how little we control when the body fails. There is a human story wrapped around this pedagogy too. In the texts and in traditional performances, monks and family members cultivate rituals that make the dying person feel seen. The lamas' recitations are not just doctrinal, they are acts of compassion. They model a culture in which death is embedded in community care rather than isolated in sterile rooms. That social fabric is itself a kind of training. Witnessing someone die, saying the words aloud, and holding attention steady are all practices that shape how a culture understands mortality. As we prepare to enter the Bardo of visions in earnest, to explore how those inner theaters turn into either liberation or the seeds of rebirth, a few points need to sit with us. First, the Tibetan account is not naive wishful thinking. It is an elaborated, experiential framework, born of centuries of contemplative practice and clinical ritual. Second, parallels with modern NDE reports and with Jungian psychology are intriguing and suggestive, but they do not amount to scientific validation. Third, the ethical core of the teaching, that training the mind now affects the outcome at death, is a proposition with practical implications, whether or not one accepts the metaphysical scaffolding the tradition supplies. What follows next will take us deeper into the Bardo of visions, the luminous apparitions, the archetypal faces, and the techniques the tradition prescribes to meet them. We will examine how recognition functions as the pivotal act, how fear and attachment act as traps, and how sympathetic practices like Tonglen and mantra can reorient the mind away from habitual reactivity. We will also return to contemporary testimonies, survivors who describe visions and lights, to consider how their stories intersect with the Tibetan map. But before we step through that doorway, one last invitation. Consider your own small bardos. Where in your day does identity soften? When do you glimpse the mirror of awareness and mistake the reflection for reality? Noticing those moments is not morbidity, it's practice. The Bardo Thodol's radical claim is simply this: the way you meet small endings in life prepares you for the greatest ending you will face. And so we continue, moving from the luminous thresholds towards the theater where the mind stages its final dramas. As the door of the inner theater opens, the lights shift again. The Bardo of Visions is not a single scene, but an unfolding gallery, an emotional kaleidoscope in which the mind, suddenly freed from its usual sensory anchors, paints with its deepest pigments. Here the luminous, inviting images and the furious, jagged ones alternate, overlay, and cascade. They arrive not as random phantoms, but as charged invitations to cling, to flee, to recognize, or to be overwhelmed. Picture yourself there if you'll allow the imagination. No longer bound to the gravity of habitual perception, you feel everything magnified. Colors have weight, sounds have faces. A compassionate being might emerge, haloed in light, who seems to embody every tenderness you have ever known. For a brief, absorbing instant, you think salvation is immediate. Everything in you wants to reach toward it. Then, without warning, a roaring figure appears, a visage stitched from old fears, a remnant of every insult and slight, a concentration of the times you acted from petty cruelty. It lashes and booms. You are asked again and again the same microscopic question the tradition repeats in different words. Do you know this? Do you see the source? Recognition is the pivot. In the Bardo Thodol's idiom, if you perceive the visions as your own mental events, transient, conditioned, not absolute, you can remain unattached. The compassion form dissolves, the wrathful form loses its bite. If you fail to recognize them, if you instinctively chase the alluring or fight the terrifying, you are swept into narratives those images carry. The imagery becomes a script that you inhabit, and once inside that script, momentum accumulates. The theater turns into a corridor, the corridor into a pull. When Western thinkers first encountered such vivid personifications, deities who frighten and deities who embrace, some saw mythic resonances. Jungian analysis offers vocabulary here. These figures look like archetypes, deep structures of imagination and feeling that surface in extreme states. From Jung's viewpoint, a wrathful deity is indistinguishable in structural terms from the shadow one meets in a dream or an emergent neurosis. Both are dense with content, complex, frightening, and often paradoxically instructive. The Bardo Thodol seems to anticipate this line of thought by asking the dying to treat the visions as teachers, not enemies. Sometimes the most terrifying forms are precisely the ones that, when understood, catalyze transformation. Near-death accounts provide another texture to this pattern. Many people who've been resuscitated report a sequence resembling the Bardo map: an initial luminosity, then encounters with beings or landscapes that feel saturated with meaning, and later a strong sense of being pulled back to the body. In some narratives, the peaceful is overwhelmingly attractive. In others, the terrifying is a jolt that forces psychological examination. These reports vary widely, in detail, cultural coloring, and emotional valence, but the recurrence of certain motifs is striking. Here again, we must be careful. Similarity in accounts does not amount to proof of metaphysical truth. It is, however, suggestive that human minds, under certain physiological and psychological conditions, produce remarkably congruent phenomenology.
Before we travel further into the specifics of how vision figures are described, an important cautionary note. When we move from description to speculation about what these experiences mean in metaphysical terms, we are leaving the territory of repeatable evidence and entering the landscape of interpretation. Different disciplines, ritual specialists, psychologists, neurologists, philosophers, bring different questions and different standards of proof. The Bardo Thodol brings centuries of practice and a rich practical vocabulary for navigating these states. Modern researchers bring careful documentation and an awareness of how physiology shapes experience. Both perspectives are valuable. Neither should be allowed to pronounce definitive answers where uncertainty remains. Hold that humility as we explore. Within the bardo of visions, peaceful deities typically appear first in many traditional accounts. They manifest in forms tailored to the individual, sometimes as teachers you loved, sometimes as archetypal embodiments of mercy. Their radiance can be blinding in the best sense, a purity that seems to strip away falsity. The text instructs the dying to accept them without clinging, and to see them as expressions of mind's luminous nature rather than objects to possess. If one dwells in appreciation without greed, those visions may dissolve back into the clear luminosity from which they arose. Then come the wrathful ones. Their forms are deliberately designed in language and imagery to resist attachment. They are explosive energies, flames, fangs, distorted bodies that seem to threaten annihilation. But in the tradition's logic, these are not demonic outsiders bent on one's destruction. They are, instead, the mind's own turbulence made manifest. The practice the text recommends is radical, but simple in essence. Recognition without rejection. See the fury for what it is. Do not recoil in shame. Do not accentuate it through aversion. This response is psychologically precise. Avoiding both fascination and aversion is a training in equanimity. A vivid modern analogue is the situation in which trauma survivors describe flashbacks, intense re-experiencing that demands a delicate form of witnessing rather than repression or fixation. The Bardo Thodol, written in the idiom of its time, prescribes a similar witnessing stance for the vision figures. Again, the key word is recognition, an unblinking seeing that does not add fuel. What does recognition feel like? Tradition describes it as a peculiar calmness, not stupor. There is clarity without panic, a kind of straightforward seeing that is free from the amplifying distortions of craving and aversion. When recognition occurs, the form collapses back into its source, and the mind is briefly unobstructed. That moment is fragile and can be fleeting. Habit can snatch it away.
The practice recommended for living persons is to cultivate that unblinking witnessing now, so that the reflex becomes familiar when the stakes are highest. This is where practice in daily life intersects most obviously with the Bardo's stakes. Practices are not magical guarantees. They are incremental reconfigurations of attention. A simple mindfulness meditation, steadying the breath, observing the arising emotions, naming them without clinging, does not in itself ferry you through post-mortem horizons. but it does accustom the nervous system to a stance of observation that can be recognized later as the same stance the text calls for in the Bardos. Tonglen, we have said, trains the heart toward radical compassion by asking the practitioner metaphorically to inhale suffering and exhale relief. Mantra repetition habituates the mind to a single stabilizing syllable or phrase. Over years, these practices change the density and direction of habitual tendencies. I want to underline a key ethical limit here. None of these practices should be presented as foolproof death avoidance techniques. They are rather lived disciplines that alter the muscle memory of attention and feeling. What the Bardo Thodol claims is probabilistic. Certain qualities of mind make certain outcomes more likely. The text's frame is not mechanistic determinism, it is conditional. Cultivate clarity and compassion, and you increase the probability that recognition will occur when perception is most intense. It is also worth observing how these practices function socially. Monastic training and ritual contexts compress decades of disciplined attention into a structured life with community, ritual, and teacherly guidance. For lay practitioners, fragmentary and inconsistent practice is common. Still, even small, repeated acts of attention can accumulate into meaningful change. The tradition values continuity. A life patterned by mindfulness, ethical attention, and compassion is a life that shapes the way one faces final transitions. Let's step back into that late-night Himalayan room to illustrate how this plays out in practice. The lama's voice has a steady, almost engineered cadence, an art that comes from countless recitations. He does not merely recite words, he frames them with an understanding of how attention works. He knows where a hearing person might fixate, he knows which phrases soothe panic and which point toward recognition. He speaks in a voice tuned to the dying person's needs, shifting intensity when terror mounts and softening when tenderness is required. Family members bring warmth, they hold hands, they remind the dying of names and stories that ground identity without encouraging clinging. Here the therapeutic and the sacred blend. The lama's words are not abstract instructions, they are an embodied technology of accompaniment, a human calibration of attention at a moment when cognition thins and habit tends to steer.
This bedside model has direct resonance with modern palliative care. Good hospice work, at its best, mirrors the lama's practical compassion. The difference is that in Tibetan contexts, the speech is explicitly cosmological, naming lights and deities, whereas in modern hospitals, the speech is often medical and psychologically oriented, yet both can stabilize and orient the dying. In each case, the presence of another person who names experience and reduces isolation changes the dying person's environment. Ritual offers a vocabulary for the so-called ineffable. Scientific care offers symptom management and emotional support. Both are forms of attention that shape experience. Turning now to the Bardo of rebirth, the third principal state in the Bardo Thodol's map, imagine the theater of visions collapsing into a kind of drafting room. The mind, having been engaged by images and emotional charge, begins to assemble a narrative architecture. This is not instantaneous. The Tibetan account often describes a sequence of transformations in which etheric tendencies, habits of mind that consistently repeat, begin to coalesce into a trajectory. Intention, even the smallest tug of desire, acts like a seed. It attracts forms and elements that fit its shape. Karma, in the tradition's language, is the accumulated momentum of these intentions and tendencies. Think of karma here not as cosmic punishment or reward, but as a patterning force. Preferences, aversions, and habits sculpt the way attention unfolds, and attention sculpts the field into which consciousness moves. If a person habitually responded to life with anger, that register of energy will likely cull into the formative patterns at the threshold of rebirth. If a person cultivated generosity, tenderness, and clear, steady attention, the formative forces will lean toward continuity of those traits. The tradition uses metaphors, painters, seed forms, architects, to communicate a complex interplay between ethical life and mental habit. An important nuance: the Bardo Thodol does not treat karma as an absolute ledger. It speaks of permeability. Small acts of recognition in the Bardo states can interrupt large currents. The tradition insists on micro-options. A single moment of steady seeing can redirect momentum away from a habitual pull. That is the radical practicality at its center. Training is not only about grand gestures, but about the refinement of moment-to-moment responsiveness. The moral psychology is precise. It says, the continuity of the mind is not a sealed fate. It is a process shaped by the quality of attention and intention. How does contemporary science read this? Neuroscientists studying dying brains find that certain patterns, sudden surges of synchronous activity, atypical firing in visual and limbic circuits, can produce intense, coherent, and sometimes meaningful experiences.
Researchers emphasize caution. The mapping between circuit dynamics and phenomenological content is complex and incomplete. Still, the basic observation that intense neurophysiological states can yield vivid inner worlds resonates with the Bardo pattern. Certain brain conditions may permit, or at least correlate with, the experiences the Tibetan map describes. Psychologists point out that cultural background supplies narrative frames that shape the content of the visions, much as a script helps a theater company produce a play. The interplay between raw experiential surge and culturally provided script is fertile ground for interdisciplinary inquiry. Again, humility is necessary. Neuroscience can offer mechanisms for how vivid experiences arise. Cultural history explains why certain images appear. Contemplative practice might explain why recognition occurs more readily in some people than in others. But none of these alone resolves the ontological question of whether consciousness, as such, continues beyond biological termination in a manner describable as the Bardo Thodol's map. What is clear, however, is that the converging lines of ritual practice, subjective reports, and scientific observation make the Bardo Thodol an unusually rich object for study, not as proof of any single metaphysical thesis, but as an integrated practice that has historically shaped how people die and how communities care for the dying. Practical implications for life are where the teaching proves most direct. The Bardo Thodol's central ethical claim is deceptively simple: living disciplines the dying. By that, it means that consistent practices of attention, compassion, and ethical behavior change the texture of the mind, so that when face-to-face with final events, one's responses are different. This is not metaphysical coercion, it is psychological training with moral consequences. So, what does that training look like in daily life? It is less about dramatic, rarefied exercises, and more about the habitual shaping of attention. Start with small but persistent practices, a daily sitting where you familiarize yourself with the awareness that observes thought without automatically reacting. Let your meditation sessions be short but honest, an honest noting of the tendencies that pull you: aversion, craving, pride. Pair that with Tonglen or another compassion practice. Imagine for 5 minutes breathing in the rawness of another's pain and breathing out whatever relief you can. Engage in acts of generosity that require vulnerability, listening to someone whose pain makes you uncomfortable, staying present rather than offering a quick fix. Practice ethical restraint in small ways. Hold your tongue in an argument where your reaction would be cruel. Choose to act when the easier option would be to look away. Over months and years, these small acts accumulate like deposits in a psychological bank. Another accessible practice is reflective rehearsal.
Occasionally, take a moment to imagine how you would want to meet loss and endings, your own and others, and then practice the qualities that would support such meetings: steadiness, curiosity, compassion. This is not morbid anticipation, it's rehearsal. Athletes rehearse ideal movements in their mind. So can the ethically minded rehearse responses to fundamental human situations. Crucially, the tradition emphasizes community. The lama's bedside presence is more than symbolic. It's a reminder that dying is a social process. Build relationships where honest presence is cultivated. Practice holding others without needing to fix them. Learn the language of compassionate speech. The Bardo Thodol thrives in a cultural ecology where the dying are accompanied, where death is not banished from sight, but integrated into communal life. There is a temptation, especially when confronted with dramatic descriptions of vision and light, to seek technical shortcuts, mantras one can recite at the last second, breath techniques to perform when death approaches. The Bardo Thodol and responsible teachers consistently resist this temptation. It is not that words and techniques have no value. They do. A familiar mantra or prayer can be an anchor, but no technique functions outside of a broader life of training. The tradition warns against last-minute fixes precisely because the mind, under crisis, tends to revert to deeply ingrained patterns. Preparation requires a life of practice, not one-off strategies. Let us return once more to narratives from those who have crossed the threshold and returned. Their stories vary widely, and historians and psychologists have cataloged many differences. Some return praising a life transformed by an encounter with unconditional love. Others report being pulled back by unfinished obligations or by the frailty of their body's ties. Some describe seeing relatives and friends who greet them with warmth. Others depict landscapes that seem to be composed of symbolic elements from their culture. These variations matter because they show that while there may be structural commonalities in the dying process, the content is shaped by personal history, belief systems, and neurobiology. Again, the convergence is not absolute proof of a universal metaphysical map. It's a pattern that invites respectful study. One of the most compelling modern conversations around the Bardo Thodol concerns its psychological sophistication. The text anticipates many modern psychotherapeutic insights, the idea that unconscious material surfaces under stress, that life narratives are reconstructed at critical moments, that relational presence alters subjective experience. Contemporary therapists sometimes draw on contemplative resources, mindfulness being the most widely known, but the full corpus of Tibetan pragmatic practices around dying remains little integrated into mainstream psychological care. That gap presents both ethical opportunities and challenges.
On the one hand, ritual knowledge could enrich end-of-life care. On the other, cultural sensitivity and careful adaptation are essential to avoid appropriation or simplification. Which brings us to another crucial caution: cultural respect. The Bardo Thodol is enmeshed with Tibetan religious culture, part of a network of cosmology, practice, lineage, and ritual necessity. Extracting pieces for secular use without context risks flattening complex spiritual technologies into trendy techniques. It is possible to learn from the tradition without assimilating it shallowly. Approaching it with curiosity, humility, and collaboration with knowledgeable practitioners is the pathway both to ethical engagement and to meaningful adaptation. There is also a practical boundary we must insist upon. Do not attempt advanced practices like FOA, consciousness transference, or other esoteric death rites without genuine transmission, guidance, and a foundation of practice. These practices, where they are part of the tradition, are embedded in lineages and require careful training. Public discussion of their general contours is permissible. Instruction in performing them concretely without supervision is not. Now, as the narrative arc nears its emotional center, consider the ethical and existential implication the Bardo Thodol evokes. Living as training for dying reframes the moral life. When you see daily acts as rehearsals for the most consequential moment, when the light arrives or the visions rise, you are invited into a life of deliberate attention. This is not asceticism for its own sake. It is an invitation to live more fully, with more presence, with more tenderness, because those qualities change your moment-by-moment orientation. What was abstract becomes urgent and practical. To make this urgent actionable, take a few tried-and-true practices and fold them into mundane life. First, cultivate a short daily practice of recognizing impermanence. Sit for 5 minutes and observe a single breath, noticing its arising and passing. Let the experience of transience sink in and practice responding with curiosity rather than story. Second, practice small acts of Tonglen, again, briefly, with guidance if possible, so you begin to alter habitual self-centeredness with a trained compassion. Third, design moments of presence in your daily relationships. Put down your phone during a meal. Listen without thinking of responses. Practice holding difficult emotions in others without the need to fix them. Over time, these small attentional calibrations create a mind that, when faced with the extraordinary, has at least some familiarity with the quality the Bardo Thodol recommends. The climax of the tradition's argument is not metaphysical bravado, it is an ethical summons. Train now because what you have trained will be what's available later. That summons implies responsibility, both to yourself and to those around you. Community care for the dying matters.
Ritual matters. Language matters. The ways you speak about death to your loved ones, the ways you practice presence, the communities you build, all of these contribute to the conditions of your dying. At the same time, there is a liberating tenderness in the teaching. Acceptance of impermanence can soften fear. The Bardo Thodol does not demand perfection. It offers a path for incremental change. It invites you to take small steps, to build habits of attention, compassion, to cultivate relationships that will hold you when you can no longer hold yourself. Before we close, it's worth acknowledging that the Bardo Thodol can feel strange to modern sensibilities. Its language is saturated with metaphoric imagery and ritual specificity. To an outsider, the talk of deities may sound archaic. To a practitioner, those deities are mnemonic devices, psychological technologies shaped to elicit recognition. Between those poles lies the opportunity for translation, not to sanitize or appropriate, but to learn the underlying psychological insights and adapt them ethically. This is the path of respectful integration. Study, practice, and collaboration with the tradition's living custodians. Let us end then where this exploration began, with the question posed by the title: what have we unraveled about the mysterious book that claims to map life after death? We have found that it offers a coherent, practice-oriented map, a set of observations and techniques embedded in ritual and community, aimed at helping the dying recognize the luminous nature of mind and avoid being seduced by habitual patterns. We have seen that elements of its map resonate with modern reports of near-death experience and with psychological theories about archetype and shadow. We have also seen the limits. Ritual and narrative do not, by themselves, constitute empirical proof of metaphysical continuities. What they do offer is a tested practical language for orienting attention at life's most fragile edge. If you take anything from this, let it be this double posture: curiosity and humility. Curiosity to explore these rich interfaces between ancient practice and contemporary experience. Humility to hold the provisional nature of any interpretation. The Bardo Thodol offers tools for living more intentionally, whether or not you accept every metaphysical claim it advances. Its insistence that small, repeated acts of recognition reshape the mind is an ethical proposition that can be tested in life without requiring you to commit to a theological system. So, what now? If this conversation touched a place inside you, fear, curiosity, grief, or wonder, carry that feeling into practice. Start small. Notice impermanence. Cultivate a short sitting practice. Speak with compassion, and attend to the dying in your life with presence rather than avoidance.
Learn about the tradition with care. Read translations, seek teachers with integrity, and remember to contextualize practices rather than extracting them as fads. If you are a caregiver, consider how the bedside presence, steady speech, and compassionate ritual of the lama might inform your practice in ways that honor both tradition and the needs of diverse communities. And finally, a reflective question to leave you with. Imagine for a moment that the next time you face an ending, big or small, you meet it with the same attentive steadiness you practice today. How would your choices change? What relationships would you repair? What words would you speak? Let that image be a gentle engine for living differently. If this exploration invited more questions, I've made a companion video that dives into the practical forms of practice mentioned here and interviews with scholars and practitioners who work at the intersection of ritual and science. If you want to go deeper, watch that next. If this video moved you, share it with someone who's wrestling with questions of death, care, or meaning, and leave one reflection below. What small practice would you start today to live like you're training for the end?